The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the ordinary stillness of a rural valley at dusk, but a suffocating quiet that feels alive, almost watchful. It is the silence of a place where time itself has stopped, where life once flourished, but has been violently and inexplicably torn away. The paths that wind through the settlement are still intact, though overgrown with moss and weeds that cling to the crumbling stone. The doorways gape open, as though the inhabitants stepped out only moments ago, and yet inside, the air is heavy with abandonment. A single chair sits at a crooked angle before a fireplace gone cold for decades. Tools are left where hands once gripped them, rusted now but still poised in mid-task. There is no sign of departure, no frantic escape, no scattered belongings. Instead, it looks as though the people simply drifted into slumber and never returned. Legends say that this was once a thriving community. Families worked the fields from dawn to dusk, children played along the riverbanks, and the smoke of cooking fires curled into the evening sky. It was a place no different from a dozen other villages tucked into the hills of the old world, a cluster of homes bound together by shared hardship and simple joys. Yet it is remembered now not for its life, but for its death. What marks this village apart is not war, nor famine, nor plague, but something stranger, something that defies the explanations of both science and faith. For on one night, an ordinary night, as the stories go, every soul within these walls closed their eyes, surrendered to the cradle of sleep, and never opened them again. When wanderers from neighboring settlements eventually arrived, they found the villagers lying peacefully in their beds, or slumped at their tables, or curled upon the floor, as though overtaken by sudden fatigue. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of suffering, no wounds or sickness carved upon their bodies. They looked merely asleep. But the days passed, then weeks, and still none stirred. The air thickened with the stench of death, and the realization dawned that the village had been emptied of the living in a single night. Its pulse stopped without warning. From that moment forward, whispers began that this was no natural tragedy, but a place cursed, marked by forces that wait beyond the veil of our understanding. Imagine stepping into that place as an outsider, as one of the first to bear witness. The livestock wander untended, their bleats echoing through the valley without answer. Meals remain half-prepared, bread dough rising in bowls, stews cooled to a skin atop forgotten fires. A cradle rocks gently though no hand touches it, moved only by the draught that snakes through cracked shutters. And everywhere, you find them, men, women, children, all caught in the same eternal stillness, their faces serene, their eyes closed as though the sleep had been welcome. Would your first thought be plague or poison, or would you too wonder if something unseen had swept through the night, laying its hand upon them all at once? The locals, of course, had their own stories ready. Some say the village was built upon forbidden ground, where ancient bones had once been buried, and the dead had simply risen to reclaim what was theirs. Others whisper of a pact broken, of rituals abandoned, of sacred oaths forgotten until the punishment came due. There are even tales that the villagers themselves had prayed for release from hunger, from hardship, from the grinding cruelty of survival, and that their prayers were answered in the form of an endless sleep. These legends differ, but they share the same unsettling conclusion. Whatever took place here was not meant for human comprehension. Today the ruins remain, visited only by the curious or the foolish. Scholars arrive with their instruments, determined to measure gases, to test soil, to seek evidence of toxins or natural disasters. Yet their findings are always inconclusive, their theories thin shadows that fail to illuminate the mystery. Superstition lingers stronger than science here. Travelers who pass through at dusk claim to feel an overwhelming drowsiness, an unnatural heaviness pressing down upon their eyelids. Some swear they hear the faint sound of breathing, not their own, carried on the wind from the hollowed-out homes. Others speak of whispers, a lullaby in a language they do not recognize, that fades the moment they try to listen closely. And so the story endures, whispered across generations, the village that went to sleep and never woke again. It is more than a tale of history. It has become a symbol of dread, a reminder that even in an age of reason and discovery, there remain pockets of the world where the rules falter, where humanity's certainty unravels. Here, in this quiet hollow of stone and soil, we confront the one truth we fear most, that we are not in control, and that one night, without warning, sleep itself may betray us. This is where our journey begins, a place frozen in time, haunted not by ghosts but by questions. We will retrace the steps of the villagers, sift through the legends, and search for the threads of truth woven within centuries of silence. Was it nature, faith, or something darker that closed their eyes forever? As we peel back the layers, we must tread carefully, for this is not just history. It is a story that warns, that unsettles, that lingers long after the telling. Night in the village descended the way it always did, slow and quiet, the horizon folding itself into the deep blue of dusk. Smoke from the hearths curled lazily upward, catching the faint light of the moon. To an observer, nothing seemed unusual, nothing to mark this evening apart from any other. Yet in hindsight, every detail of that night feels weighted, like a stage being carefully set for a final act. Families gathered inside their cottages, sharing what little food they had managed to harvest. The low murmur of conversation, the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls, the occasional burst of laughter, these were the sounds of ordinary life, unaware of the extraordinary fate approaching. The children played by the fire, their shadows dancing on the walls, their eyelids heavy from the day's excitement. The elders exchanged quiet words, stories of long seasons survived, tales passed down about the land and its hidden dangers. The villagers were not strangers to hardship. They had endured famine, storms, and the endless labor of survival, and yet that night there was no sense of foreboding, no sign that they felt what was coming. They ate, they prayed, they closed their doors against the cold. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whispering audience. It is said that some lingered longer than usual. A farmer, finishing a final check on his animals, found them restless, shifting in their pens, their eyes gleaming strangely in the torchlight. He dismissed it as the bite of the night air. A mother sang a lullaby to her infant, the melody carrying through the stillness, drifting across walls thin with age. A group of youths, too restless to sleep, sat in the darkened square, watching the stars. Each moment seemed ordinary, but in retelling, each carries a ghostly weight. For these were the last known acts of life, before an entire community surrendered to a slumber from which no one would wake. Imagine the quieting of the village as the hour grew late. One by one, candles were snuffed, shutters latched, fires left to smolder, a veil of sleep spread from home to home, an invisible tide that swept through the rooms. A father laid his head on a table, intending only to rest for a moment. A child curled up beside a dog, their breathing slowing together. The elders eased into their beds, murmuring brief prayers, never finishing the final words. Even those still awake, those who had resisted, felt their bodies pulled toward drowsiness, as if something beyond mere fatigue was settling over them. Some may have fought it, blinking hard, trying to keep their eyes open, but the struggle was brief. The weight was too heavy, irresistible. Accounts from neighboring settlements, told in hushed tones years later, claim that the night itself seemed unusually still. No barking dogs, no echo of voices, no light lingering from the windows. It was as though the entire valley had been muted, as though the village had been swallowed by something vast and unseen. When morning came, and the sun cast its first rays across the rooftops, there was no stir of activity. No smoke rising from chimneys, no clatter of buckets at the well. The fields lay untouched. The paths were empty. At first, the stillness may have seemed nothing more than late rising. Villagers slept in after hard days of labor, but as hours passed, as the sun climbed higher, curiosity turned to unease. A traveler passing near the settlement later recalled how unnatural the silence felt, how even the birds seemed to avoid the place. He knocked at the doors, but no voices answered. He peered into a window and froze. A family sat at their table, bowls of food untouched, their heads slumped forward as if dozing. Yet the moment lingered wrong. Their stillness was too complete, their bodies too lifeless. What happened in those final hours before discovery remains a mystery that haunts every retelling. Did the villagers experience dreams, visions, some shared passage into another realm, or did they simply close their eyes, unaware that their final sleep had come? Some folkloric accounts suggest that they were lulled, not by fatigue but by something darker, a presence that moved like a mist through the homes, pressing upon lungs, clouding minds, beckoning them deeper and deeper into slumber. The legends say it was not a sickness, but a summons, a call that could not be resisted. We cannot know what they felt, what they saw. Perhaps for them it was merciful, a gentle drift into unconsciousness, their burdens lifted in silence. Or perhaps there was a moment of realization, a flash of terror in the darkness, when they understood what was happening, but could not resist. Did a mother reach for her child, unable to shake her awake? Did a man attempt to stagger from his home, only to collapse before reaching the door? Or did they all, without struggle, without fear, simply surrender, as though answering an ancient command? The last night of the village has become a canvas for speculation, painted with equal parts fact and fear. For historians, it was a moment, lost to time, irretrievable and unknowable. For folklorists, it was the climax of a tale foretold in whispers and warnings. For those who believe in curses, it was the appointed hour when a promise was collected. What binds all these interpretations together is the sense that something unnatural unfolded in that silence. A community did not simply die, it disappeared into a sleep beyond death, leaving behind a stage perfectly set, untouched, waiting for others to stumble upon the aftermath. That night stands as the invisible line dividing life from legend, the before and the after. The villagers did not know it as their last. They sat down to eat, to sing, to tell stories, to tuck their children into bed, believing that dawn would come as it always had. But dawn came only for the empty houses, the abandoned fields, and the chilling mystery that still lingers centuries later. The night closed over them like a shroud, and with it a whole community slipped into history, not through war, not through famine, but through the quiet betrayal of sleep itself. The morning after the village fell silent should have been like any other. The sun rose over the hills, spilling light across the valley floor, igniting dew into silver. From the neighboring settlements, smoke drifted into the sky as families stirred from their beds, beginning the long labor of another day. But as hours stretched on, those who looked toward the little community in the hollow noticed something strange. There was no smoke at all, no sign of stirring, no distant shouts from farmers in the fields, no bark of dogs greeting the morning, just an unmoving emptiness. At first, no one thought much of it. Perhaps the villagers had simply risen late, but by midday the silence became undeniable. Something was wrong. The first to investigate were traders who passed along the old road that skirted the edge of the village. They had stopped many times before, for water or bread, or to exchange a few coins for supplies. This time, as they drew closer, they felt the strangeness at once. The road into the village was eerily undisturbed. No children ran to greet them, no animals tugged at tethers. The doors of cottages stood ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, yet no voices came from within. The traders called out, but their shouts bounced back unanswered, swallowed by the quiet. An unease settled over them, though curiosity pressed them onward. What they found inside remains one of the most unsettling discoveries ever recorded in local lore. In the first cottage, the fire had burned down to nothing, embers long cold. A family sat at a table, their bowls of food half-eaten, spoons fallen from their hands, their heads slumped forward, their eyes closed as if they had fallen asleep mid-meal. There were no signs of struggle, no spilled dishes, no overturned chairs. The scene was disturbingly ordinary, except that the bodies were lifeless. The traders fled the house in panic, but the nightmare did not end there. In the next dwelling, they found the same, a mother and infant lying together in bed, motionless. In another, an old man in his chair by the window, chin resting on his chest, his breath long ceased. House after house revealed the same tableau, villagers frozen in their final positions, their faces calm, their postures relaxed. It was not the chaos of violence or disease, but a stillness that felt staged, deliberate, wrong. The stench of death had already begun to rise, though it was muffled by the illusion of sleep. For a terrible moment, the traders thought they might wake, that any second, a child would stir, or an elder would cough, shaking the spell, but none did. The weight of realization broke upon them. The entire village, every last inhabitant, had perished in the same night, in the same inexplicable way. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Soon, others arrived, neighbors, priests, local officials, each hoping for an explanation. None was found. Livestock wandered aimlessly, thirsty and bleating, tethered near homes now empty of caretakers. Bread dough still sat rising in bowls, meals left unfinished, as though time itself had stopped. In one chilling account, a pot of stew was discovered beside a hearth, a wooden spoon resting inside. The food had spoiled, but it was clear that someone had been cooking even as death overtook them. The image that emerges is one of life interrupted, snuffed out in an instant, leaving everything intact except the living. The bodies baffled all who saw them. Unlike victims of plague, their skin bore no lesions, no signs of sickness. Unlike victims of famine, their faces were not gaunt with suffering. And unlike those slain by violence, their homes bore no marks of intrusion, no struggle. They looked simply asleep, peaceful, as though some unseen force had whispered through the night and pulled them across the threshold of life without pain, without alarm. It was the serenity that terrified most of all. Death, people reasoned, should look like death. This looked like something else entirely. Fear spread quickly through the witnesses. Some refused to stay inside the village, terrified that whatever force had struck might linger still, waiting to claim more lives. Others crossed themselves and muttered prayers, believing they stood upon cursed ground. Rumors bloomed in every direction. Some swore it was a punishment from God, that the villagers had been struck down for hidden sins. Others claimed it was the work of dark spirits, that something had crept into their dreams and carried them away. Still others whispered that the villagers had been chosen, spirited off to another world while their bodies remained behind. Theories multiplied, but none offered comfort. Officials faced an impossible task. How does one bury an entire village? Records suggest that attempts were made to inter the dead, though the number was overwhelming. Some bodies were burned in haste, others left where they lay as fear of contamination spread. Yet nothing matched the behavior of plague or poison known at the time. No animals perished, no outsiders fell ill after visiting. It was as though the curse had been meant only for the inhabitants of that place, and no one else. The discovery marked the beginning of the legend, the seed of every story told afterward. The traders and neighbors who stumbled upon the dead could never rid themselves of the images. Their testimony was carried outward, repeated in hushed voices, embroidered with each telling. Soon the tale was known far beyond the valley, the village that went to sleep and never woke. To some, it became a cautionary story, a warning about pride, greed, or the breaking of old oaths. To others it was a mystery that gnawed at reason, proof that there are still corners of the earth where the natural order bends, where explanations falter. The memory of the discovery is more than history, it is a wound. Those who stepped into that silent village, who saw with their own eyes the frozen peace of the dead, carried the weight for the rest of their lives. They had walked into a place where life had been erased, where the boundary between the living and the sleeping had collapsed. They left with a story that would echo for centuries, and with the kind of fear that cannot be spoken aloud without trembling, the fear that what happened there could happen anywhere, without warning, without reason, without mercy. Long before the night of eternal sleep, the land on which the village stood carried whispers of unease. The hills were not empty. They were older than the memory of the people who came to settle them. The forests clung thick around the slopes, their trees gnarled and twisted, their roots breaking through the soil like veins. Travelers avoided the valley when possible, claiming that the air grew heavy there, that the birds fell silent as one entered, and that a strange drowsiness pressed down upon the body like a hand. And yet, despite these warnings, a community chose to build its homes in that hollow, lured by the river, the fertile earth, and the promise of survival. Folklore holds that the land was not theirs to take. According to stories carried by the region's oldest families, the hills were once burial grounds for an ancient people, long vanished yet never forgotten. Mounds still dotted the valley floor, low rises covered in grass and stone, said to mark graves. Children were warned never to play upon them. Elders refused to disturb the soil, muttering that the dead beneath still dreamed, and that those who disrupted their slumber would find themselves bound to it. The villagers who later built their homes there were accused, in hushed tones, of arrogance. They ignored the old laws of the land, ploughing fields across ground meant to remain untouched. Other tales tell of a spirit said to haunt the hills, a figure neither human nor beast, known only as the Keeper of Sleep. It was said to walk the valley on moonless nights, its footsteps soft as falling snow, its presence marked by a sudden weariness that overcame anyone in its path. Those who claimed to have glimpsed it described a tall, shadowy shape, with eyes that glowed faintly as if lit from within. It never attacked, never spoke, but those who saw it often reported falling into strange, deep sleeps afterward, plagued by dreams too vivid to forget. To the locals, the keeper was both a guardian and a curse, a reminder that the valley belonged to forces unseen. When the settlers first built their homes, some believed they had struck a bargain. They held small rituals at the edges of the forest, offering bread, milk, or coins to the earth itself. Children were told to whisper thanks when crossing the burial mounds. But as years passed, as generations changed, such practices began to fade. The younger families scoffed at the old superstitions. They stopped leaving offerings, stopped whispering prayers. The land was theirs now, they believed, earned through labor and sweat. The keeper, the mounds, the spirits, they were nothing more than tales to frighten children. But the old stories do not vanish so easily. Nearby villages watched uneasily, whispering that the community in the hollow was forgetting its place. Some claimed to see strange lights flickering at night above the burial grounds, as if lanterns moved without hands to carry them. Others swore they heard chanting carried on the wind, low and mournful, though no one could say where it came from. A few spoke of dreams that spread outward, shared across households, in which voices urged the dreamers to rest and remember. When the great sleep finally came, it was these warnings that resurfaced. Neighbors remembered the tales of the Keeper of Sleep and the burial mounds. They whispered that the villagers had been reclaimed, taken into the same dreaming state as the ancients below them. Their peaceful expressions, their undisturbed surroundings, was this not exactly how the legends had described the punishment? A slumber too deep to escape, a stillness that mocked the boundary between life and death. Some priests argued that it was not a spirit at all but divine retribution. The valley, they insisted, had been cursed for idolatry, for abandoning ritual, for building homes on ground meant to remain sacred. They pointed to older records of famines and plagues, events always explained as the wrath of heaven. To them, the endless sleep was simply another form of punishment, one more terrible because it struck without pain, without chaos, leaving no chance for repentance. Yet not all saw the curse as punishment. Among certain storytellers, the tragedy was interpreted as fulfillment. They believed the villagers had been chosen, called into an eternal dream where they would live on, united with ancestors and spirits in a world beyond the waking. Death, they argued, had not come. It had only disguised itself as sleep. For those who feared the dark, this story offered comfort, but for others, it only deepened the mystery. If the villagers had indeed been taken, why them? Why then? The legend of the cursed hills grew with every retelling. Travelers avoided the valley entirely, taking longer routes rather than risk passing through. Those who did venture close often reported strange sensations, an unnatural heaviness of the limbs, a sudden fog of the mind, a pull toward unconsciousness. Some claimed they awoke hours later, lying on the grass, unable to remember how they had fallen asleep. Others said they dreamt vividly of the villagers, faces pale, eyes closed, standing silently in the shadows of their own dreams, as though watching. Generations later, the curse still clung to the land. Locals refused to build there again, even when soil elsewhere grew barren. No church was ever erected on the site, no attempt at settlement made. The ruins were left to collapse in silence, vines creeping across the stones, the air thick with the weight of memory. Visitors left offerings once more, not from belief perhaps, but from fear, tokens laid at the edges of the valley to appease whatever power lingered. Coins, bread, and even locks of hair have been found left in secret, evidence that the stories, though ancient, are not forgotten. The curse in the hills has become inseparable from the story of the village, whether one believes in spirits, in divine punishment, or in coincidence. The pattern is undeniable. The land was said to be dangerous, long before the tragedy occurred. The villagers built their homes in a place warned against by generations past. They ignored the whispers, dismissed the rituals, and laughed at the notion of curses. And then, one night, the very fate foretold in stories came to pass. Perhaps it is only coincidence. Perhaps the legends grew only after the fact, reshaping the tragedy to give it meaning. But perhaps the stories were warnings after all, ignored until it was too late. The truth may never be known. What remains is the lingering unease, the sense that the valley does not forgive, that it holds the memory of those who dared disturb it. And if you stand there today, among the ruins, as dusk begins to fall, you may feel it still, that heavy air, that unnatural quiet, that subtle pull toward sleep. It is the echo of a curse whispered across centuries, the same curse that swallowed a village whole and left behind only silence. If folklore offered one explanation for the tragedy, then science sought another. The world of reason has always strained to unravel the mysteries left behind by superstition, and the village that went to sleep and never woke again was no exception. For centuries, scholars, physicians, and scientists have attempted to explain the unexplainable, to assign logic to what seems like a curse. And yet, each theory, however convincing at first glance, unravels under closer scrutiny, leaving more questions than answers. Still, the pursuit of reason has produced a collection of chilling possibilities, natural explanations that are no less terrifying than the idea of a supernatural force. One of the earliest theories was poisoning. The stillness of the bodies, the absence of violent struggle, suggested to some that the villagers may have consumed something tainted. Grain was often stored in damp conditions, vulnerable to fungus and mold. Historians point to ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, producing powerful hallucinogens and toxins. Ergot poisoning has been known to cause convulsions, madness, and even death. Entire communities have suffered from outbreaks of it, their members seized by hallucinations or driven into fits. Could it be that the villagers ate bread made from poisoned grain, slipped into unconsciousness, and never rose again? At first, this explanation seems plausible. It provides a rational framework, something that might have occurred without malice, without spirits, without curses, yet the details complicate the picture. Ergot poisoning rarely kills with such calmness. Victims writhe, seize, foam at the mouth. Their bodies bear the marks of suffering, twisted limbs, clenched jaws, violent final moments. But the villagers looked peaceful, untouched by agony. Their faces bore no evidence of torment. Their homes showed no signs of chaos. If ergot had struck, it should have left behind a scene of madness. Instead, the scene was serene, even gentle. Another theory emerged from the earth itself. In certain regions, subterranean gases escape from fissures in the ground. Invisible, odorless, and deadly, these gases can seep into homes, displacing oxygen, suffocating those inside. Carbon dioxide is one such culprit, heavy and silent, capable of pooling in valleys where air circulation is poor. In high concentrations, it causes drowsiness, confusion, then unconsciousness, followed swiftly by death. Carbon monoxide, often produced by poorly ventilated fires, is another invisible killer, slipping into lungs without warning, leaving its victims asleep forever. Scientists who have studied the valley point to this possibility with grave seriousness. Perhaps a geological event, a sudden release of gases from beneath the hills, flooded the village in the night. The inhabitants, breathing it in as they slept, would have drifted into death without struggle, without waking. Such an explanation aligns eerily with the way they were found, Bodies in natural positions, meals unfinished, expressions calm. It requires no spirits, no curses, only the cruel indifference of nature. Yet even this theory falters under scrutiny. Why did it happen only once, on that particular night? If the valley were prone to such emissions, why were there not other incidents, other tragedies of equal scale? Why did the livestock, tethered in barns or pens, survive in greater numbers than the humans? Some animals appeared restless, but they were alive, bleating and moving about, while their masters lay still. Carbon dioxide, being heavier than air, should have claimed them first, settling low where they fed and slept. And so, while the gas theory is chillingly logical, it does not fit the details with precision. A third explanation circles back to the human hand. Some whisper of deliberate poisoning, whether through food or water. Wars, feuds, and secret experiments are not unknown in history. Could the village have been targeted, its people silenced in one night by a substance slipped into their well or their stores? Modern comparisons to covert tests and government experiments feed this suspicion. Historians uncover chilling documents of communities unknowingly exposed to chemicals or diseases for the sake of research. Perhaps, some suggest, the sleeping village was one such experiment, erased afterward from records except in the whispers of folklore. But here again, the details resist. Poison, whether natural or deliberate, leaves traces: stomachs twisted in agony, vomit on the floors, panic in the eyes of the dying. Nothing of the sort was reported. The villagers looked undisturbed. There were no signs of frantic attempts to flee. No bodies collapsed mid-run. If poison was involved, it was something unlike any common substance known to history, something that soothed even as it killed, cloaking death in a false serenity. Another unsettling theory emerges from neurology. Certain parasites and diseases, though rare, are capable of inducing coma-like states, robbing their victims of consciousness while leaving their bodies intact. Imagine an illness that swept through the village with terrifying speed, shutting down the mind, pressing every inhabitant into the same dreamlike abyss. Could such a disease exist? If it did, it has never been documented elsewhere in such complete collective form. To modern science, the odds are staggering. Yet the possibility lingers, a reminder of how fragile our brains truly are, how easily the line between sleep and death might be crossed. In recent years, scientists have compared the tragedy to more contemporary phenomena. In remote parts of Siberia, for example, villagers have reported sudden waves of inexplicable sleepiness. Entire groups collapse into unconsciousness for hours or days, unable to resist the pull. Researchers blame underground gases, but no single cause has ever been definitively proven. Elsewhere, in Central Asia, communities have experienced a so-called sleeping sickness that leaves victims comatose for weeks, sometimes never recovering fully. Such modern echoes suggest that the sleeping village may not be unique. Perhaps it was one of many places touched by a mysterious force, whether chemical, geological, or biological, that science has yet to fully understand. What chills the mind most is not the thought of curses or restless spirits, but the realization that nature itself harbors dangers invisible, odorless, soundless, capable of erasing a community without struggle. A silent poison, a hidden gas, a microscopic invader. Science provides these possibilities, and they are terrifying in their own right. Yet for every theory posed, contradictions remain. For every rational answer, new questions surface. Why did it happen only once? Why so suddenly, so completely? Why did the villagers look so peaceful, as though sleep itself had claimed them rather than death? And so, the rational explanations collapse into the same void as the legends. The scientists, like the priests and the storytellers, find themselves grasping at shadows. They may dismiss curses and spirits, but their own theories falter just as easily. What remains is a mystery that resists categorization, a tragedy balanced on the edge between the natural and the supernatural. The village lies silent, its story hovering in that liminal space, where science and superstition both fail to provide comfort. In the end, the scientific lens brings us no closer to certainty, only to another kind of dread. For if the villagers were not claimed by spirits, then they were claimed by something in the air, the earth, the food they ate. Something invisible, inescapable, and merciless, something that might still drift in the soil or the wind waiting. And in some ways that is the most terrifying explanation of all. The tragedy of the sleeping village did not exist in isolation. History is scarred with the echoes of pestilence and famine, entire communities erased by forces unseen and unstoppable. When the villagers were first discovered, some of the earliest whispers sought to explain the silence through disease. In an age when plague rolled like thunder across the land, when famine drove people to starvation in their own homes, the death of an entire settlement seemed at first to fit within the grim expectations of the time. But even here, in the context of so much suffering, the details remained unnervingly strange. The Black Death had swept across continents only generations earlier, killing millions. In its wake, smaller outbreaks of plague persisted for centuries, smoldering like hidden fires that flared without warning. Communities could vanish within weeks, their dead left piled in streets or hastily buried in mass graves. Symptoms were unmistakable: swollen glands, fever, delirium, bodies twisted in agony. If plague had come to the village, why were there no such signs? Why were the dead found in positions of peace, their homes undisturbed, their faces serene? It was not the chaos of pestilence that lingered in those rooms, but a stillness wholly alien. Famine, too, haunted the land. Harsh winters, crop failures, and infestations drove countless villages into desperation. Starvation leaves unmistakable marks upon the body: wasted limbs, hollow eyes, ribs pressed sharp against parchment-thin skin. Families consumed whatever they could find: roots, bark, sometimes even the flesh of the dead. Records speak of such horrors, grim reminders of how fragile life was in those centuries. Yet the villagers bore none of these signs. Their cupboards may have been sparse, but they were not skeletal. Meals sat unfinished at their tables, bread rising, stews cooling. If hunger had been their killer, why had they left food untouched in their final moments? Another explanation offered by contemporaries was quarantine. In times of plague, it was not uncommon for entire settlements to seal themselves away, barring outsiders, hoping to starve out disease within their walls. Some historians suggest the village may have locked itself in, cutting off contact with neighbors. Perhaps in their isolation, they hoped for salvation, but death crept in regardless. This theory imagines a slow decline, bodies dropping one by one, until none remained to bury the others. Yet again, the details resist. If death had come gradually, the scene would have shown decay at different stages. Some bodies would be long gone, others fresh. Instead, they were all found together, as though death had struck in one coordinated sweep. Church records, sparse but tantalizing, offer another angle. In certain archives, there are vague notations of villages fallen into silence, communities marked as abandoned without explanation. Often these were attributed to pestilence, but the language is deliberately vague. Were they warnings or erasures? Did the church fear spreading panic, or did they conceal the true nature of what had been found? Disease was a convenient explanation, one that required no further questions, but for those who looked closely, it did not add up. The absence of suffering was the most damning contradiction. Plague is loud, famine is loud. They leave evidence not just on bodies but on homes, on streets, on the very air. Wailing, cries of hunger, the stench of disease. But the sleeping village had none of these. No marks of illness, no signs of starvation, no panic carved into the final hours. Instead, there was calm, a death too quiet, too sudden. For neighbors accustomed to the horrors of pestilence, this was more terrifying than any outbreak. It was not the familiar cruelty of disease, but something unfamiliar, something that broke the rules. Folklore emerged to fill the void where history faltered. Some said the villagers had been spared the agony of plague through a bargain, that while the rest of the land suffered, they had made a pact to avoid it, only to pay a heavier price in the end. Others insisted that famine had been at their door, and in desperation they prayed not for food but for release, begging to be freed from hunger. If true, their prayers had been answered with silence, their lives exchanged for an eternal sleep. These were stories meant not to explain but to warn. Be careful what you ask for. Be careful what bargains you strike with the unseen. In modern times, scientists have re-examined the possibility of disease with fresh eyes. Could it have been an illness now extinct, something that killed swiftly and without outward signs? Certain viral hemorrhagic fevers can move quickly, leaving behind corpses that appear deceptively calm in death. Others speculate about toxins born of famine, molds or bacteria that crept into food supplies, producing paralysis rather than pain. These modern analogies offer possibilities, but again none align perfectly with the records. The silence, the simultaneous nature of the deaths, the tranquility of the bodies, all remain unexplained. Perhaps what chills most is how ordinary the tragedy looked. To the outsider, it was not the horror of plague-ravaged corpses or the skeletal remains of famine. It was families, intact, together, preserved in the act of living. A father at the table, a mother with her child, an elder in his chair. It is this dissonance that makes the story endure. Death, when it comes through hunger or disease, leaves its scars, its evidence. But here, there was no evidence, no scars, only stillness. This is why the explanations of plague and famine, though logical within their time, never satisfied. They were too common, too ordinary, to account for something so extraordinary. People of that age lived surrounded by pestilence and hunger. They knew their signs intimately, and what they found in the sleeping village was something different, something unrecognizable even to them. The echoes of plague and famine remain part of the story, not because they solve it, but because they highlight its strangeness. In a world where death by disease and hunger was everyday reality, this village stands apart. Its fate could not be explained by the familiar, by the expected. It was something else entirely, and that, perhaps, is what terrified its neighbors most. Not that the villagers had died, but that they had died in a way no one understood, a way that could not be prepared for, defended against, or explained, and so the story moved beyond history into legend. The village was remembered not as a victim of plague or famine, but as a place touched by a deeper, darker mystery. The silence of their death contrasted too sharply with the chaos of the world around them. It was not the echo of common tragedy, but the sound of something otherworldly, something that even centuries later continues to resist all explanations. Among the many explanations whispered about the sleeping village, none are more disturbing than those tied to ritual. While the rational mind clings to famine and plague, the folkloric imagination insists on darker possibilities, forbidden ceremonies, ancient invocations, and the summoning of forces best left untouched. For in places where the earth feels thin, where the air carries strange silences and shadows lengthen unnaturally, there has always been the belief that men and women might reach across the veil, calling down blessings or damnation. Generations after the tragedy, travelers told of altars hidden deep within the village's woods, stones blackened by fire, markings etched into bark, bones scattered in ways that suggested neither feast nor burial. To some, these were remnants of common folk magic, charms for good harvest, protections against illness, invocations of fertility. But others swore the symbols were older, stranger, their geometry too precise to be dismissed as rustic superstition. Some claimed they were not protective at all, but invitations, rituals meant to draw something in rather than keep it away. The villagers, after all, lived in isolation. Cut off from broader society, their beliefs may have drifted, reshaped by oral traditions, misremembered prayers, and whispers of the old gods. The church, though ever present in official records, often turned a blind eye to rural practices so long as they remained hidden. But what happens when hidden rituals grow bolder, when desperation or curiosity pushes a community beyond harmless charms? Stories suggest that the people of the village may have sought protection through rites the church would have condemned, rites that traded comfort for danger. One tale insists the tragedy began with a harvest that failed 3 years in succession. Grain withered before ripening, livestock miscarried, infants were stillborn, hunger stalked the streets, priests prayed, but their words brought no relief. It was then, the story says, that a group of villagers turned not to the church but to something older. A woman is named in some versions, a healer, an herbalist, one who knew the plants and their spirits. She was said to have led them in a ritual beneath a full moon, chanting words no priest would recognize, words that promised abundance if spoken with sincerity. At first, the ritual seemed to work. Crops flourished. The following winter was gentle. The villagers whispered that they had found salvation, that their prayers to the unseen had been answered. But the price of bargains is always hidden at first. As the years passed, strange occurrences mounted. Shadows moved when no one stood near. Dreams grew vivid, filled with voices and faces that were not their own. Some claimed to wake in fields they had not walked into, standing barefoot in the cold dew, with no memory of how they arrived there. And then, one night, silence descended. An entire community pulled into an endless dream, never to wake. Skeptics dismiss this as folklore born from fear, but the imagery of ritual lingers, passed from generation to generation as a warning. Stories describe circles of salt left on thresholds, effigies hung in barns, and strange songs that children hummed without knowing where they had learned them. The church, arriving after the tragedy, supposedly ordered all such items burned, yet ashes remained, hidden in the cracks of stone, evidence too stubborn to erase. One of the most unsettling legends concerns a bell, said to have been cast not for the church but for the ritual circle itself. It was smaller than a chapel bell, but its tone was deep, resonant, almost inhuman. The villagers, it is said, rang it not to call each other to prayer but to summon something else, something from beneath the earth or beyond the sky. On the night they all perished, neighbors reported hearing the bell toll once, a low sound that carried unnaturally far. It was not a sound of mourning but of invocation, and when the neighbors entered the valley the next morning, the bell was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Archaeologists who later examined the area found no trace of such an artifact, no bell, no circle, no altar. But in folklore, absence often strengthens belief. The lack of evidence is seen not as proof against, but as proof of how thoroughly the rituals were erased. The church had reason to cleanse the ground, to strike all memory of forbidden practices, leaving only whispers behind. There are darker versions still. Some say the ritual was never meant for abundance, but for power, that a faction within the village had grown resentful of nearby lords, of the church, of their own poverty, and sought dominion through a pact, to summon a force that could bend fate, demand wealth, demand revenge. In this version, the ritual succeeded too well. Something answered, but rather than granting power, it claimed the entire community in one breath. To outsiders, the stillness of the village was death, but to believers, it was something worse, capture. The souls of the villagers, they say, were taken, bound to serve whatever was called forth, leaving their bodies as empty shells. It is not difficult to see why these stories endure. Rituals are a language of both fear and control. When rational explanations fail, when silence cannot be accounted for by plague or famine, people turn to the possibility of summoning. For what could better explain the totality of the village's disappearance than the idea that they had asked for something, and it had come? Even in modern retellings, ghost hunters and occult enthusiasts seek the supposed site of the rituals. Some claim the ground feels charged, compasses spinning wildly, animals refusing to cross certain boundaries. There are stories of modern visitors who spend a night there, and wake unable to remember their dreams, drained as if something had reached into their sleep. While skeptics dismiss these accounts as embellishments, they echo eerily with the core of the legend, a village that slept and never woke. Whether or not the villagers truly engaged in forbidden rites, the folklore suggests a profound cultural memory of fear, fear of what happens when boundaries are crossed. For communities living on the edge of survival, desperation often breeds dangerous bargains, and in telling their story, generation after generation warns against repeating such mistakes. To dabble with forces unseen is to risk more than death. It is to risk erasure, to vanish without explanation, leaving only whispers behind. The tragedy of the sleeping village is therefore not only a tale of mystery, but a moral parable. It tells of what happens when people turn to rituals that promise too much. Whether those rituals truly occurred, or whether they were imposed later as a way of explaining the inexplicable, they remain a central pillar of the legend, and perhaps that is the true purpose of these stories, not to explain but to warn. For in the end, the imagery of the ritual leaves us with a haunting question: did the villagers perish because of what was done to them, or because of what they themselves dared to do? When the story of the sleeping village is told, it is never only about those who died. It is also about those who stood just beyond the valley, listening to the silence. The neighbors, farmers, travelers, priests, traders, who first stumbled upon the strange stillness, became unwilling witnesses to something they could neither explain nor forget. Their accounts, fragmented and colored by fear, reveal as much about human terror as they do about the tragedy itself. At first, there was simply absence. The village no longer sent its men to market. No wagons arrived on trade days. No smoke rose from chimneys that had once burned reliably. A week passed, then two. Curiosity turned to unease. Stories began to spread in nearby hamlets. Perhaps plague had claimed them, perhaps raiders had attacked, or perhaps they had chosen to seal themselves off from the world. The decision was made, reluctantly, to investigate. A group of men traveled together, armed and wary. As they approached the valley, the first thing they noticed was the quiet. Birds sang in distant fields, but within the hollow of the village itself, silence pressed heavily. No barking of dogs, no laughter of children, not even the clatter of hooves. The road, though well worn, felt abandoned, as though the earth itself had forgotten the weight of feet. They entered the first house cautiously. Inside, they found a family seated, as though awaiting a meal, bowls half-filled, bread cooling, a jug of water tipped slightly, as if it had just been poured. The father sat upright, hands folded on the table. The mother leaned back in her chair, head tilted as if dozing. The children slumped over their plates, faces peaceful, but none stirred, none breathed. Fear spread quickly among the intruders. They left the house at once, certain that disease had claimed the family, that death clung to the air itself. Yet as they moved from house to house, the same sight greeted them, villagers in natural positions, asleep but lifeless. In some homes, meals were abandoned midway. In others, tools had been dropped, chores left unfinished. No screams, no signs of struggle, no marks of pain, only the same terrible calm. The neighbors retreated quickly, carrying with them the dread of what they had seen. Many refused to return, believing the valley cursed. Word spread through the countryside, each retelling more ominous than the last. Some claimed they had seen shadows moving inside the houses, even though the villagers were dead. Others swore they heard whispers in the air, a faint chorus rising from the valley floor. Whether these details were born of truth or fear, they cemented the idea that the place was dangerous, that to linger too long was to invite the same fate. Yet duty and curiosity compelled some to enter again, this time under the sanction of the church. Priests and clerks, accompanied by armed men, crossed themselves as they stepped into the silent streets. They too reported the uncanny serenity of the dead, the strange absence of decay. Days had passed since the village was last seen alive, yet the bodies showed no signs of corruption, no smell, no insects, no discoloration. It was as if death had pressed pause, freezing them in a moment of perpetual slumber. The church officials debated fiercely. Some argued for burial rites, others for fire, to burn the entire settlement, they said would purify the ground and prevent whatever plague or curse had struck from spreading. But others hesitated, fearing that such an act would anger God, or worse, destroy evidence of something beyond human comprehension. In the end, records are vague. Some say the villagers were buried hastily in mass graves at the edge of the valley. Others insist the bodies were left untouched, the village sealed, its silence preserved as a warning. For the neighbors, life continued, but never comfortably. Farmers who once worked the fields bordering the valley refused to go near. Cattle balked at being driven across its paths. Children were warned never to play too close. Travelers detoured rather than take the shorter road through the hollow. The village, once part of the living landscape, became a scar upon it, a place no one entered willingly. Over time, stories multiplied. Some claimed to see lights glowing in the windows at night, long after the villagers were gone. Others swore they heard faint bells, though no church bell remained. Shepherds reported hearing their names whispered when they crossed too near, a sound carried on the wind with no visible source. For the neighbors, the silence of the village did not fade with time. it deepened. The absence became a presence of its own, a weight pressing upon those who lived nearby. What is perhaps most haunting is how quickly the village slipped from absent memory. Once it was known by name, its families connected to others through trade and marriage. Yet within a few generations, its name was scarcely spoken aloud. In its place, it became the cursed hollow, the silent valley, or simply the place that sleeps. The people who once lived there were forgotten, their identities dissolved, their fate remembered only as legend. The neighbors, whether out of fear or superstition, chose not to preserve their memory, but to erase it. This erasure is itself a kind of silence, for what is more chilling than to vanish, not only in body but in history, to have lived, laughed, struggled, prayed, only to be reduced to a nameless warning in the mouths of strangers. The neighbors may not have killed the villagers, but they buried them twice, once in earth, and once in memory. And yet, it is because of the neighbors that we know the story at all. Their fragments of testimony, their fearful accounts, are the only reason the tragedy survives across centuries. Without them, the village would have disappeared entirely, swallowed whole by time. Instead, its silence lingers because of those who stood at its borders, too afraid to linger, but too shaken to forget. The silence of the neighbors was not just about the village, it was about themselves. For in their refusal to speak of it openly, in their determination to look away, they revealed their own fear of contagion, not contagion of plague, but of mystery itself. To dwell too long on the fate of the sleeping village was to risk being pulled into its silence, to risk never waking from the questions it left behind. And so the neighbors' silence became part of the curse. The tragedy was preserved not in clarity, but in whispers, in rumors, in warnings, a mystery half told, half remembered, always avoided. And perhaps that is why the village continues to haunt us. Not simply because of what happened within, but because of how those outside chose to live with it, in denial, in fear, and in silence. Time is supposed to dull memory, to wear it down until even the sharpest tragedies become smooth stones of history. But some events resist erasure. The sleeping village did not simply vanish into the past. It lived on, transformed into something darker, something more enduring. If death had claimed the villagers, then legend claimed what remained. And through legend their silence found a new kind of voice. In the generations that followed, stories of the village spread far beyond the neighboring valleys. Travelers carried whispers of the place as though it were a contagion itself, passing the tale from market to tavern, from hearth to roadside campfire. Each retelling added layers, painting the tragedy in strokes both supernatural and moral. To some, it became a tale of divine punishment, God striking down an entire community for sins committed in secret. To others, it was the work of the devil, a bargain gone wrong, a midnight pact sealed with blood. And for many, it was simply a cursed place, one where the natural order of life and death had been broken, leaving only an open wound in the land. The villagers themselves became phantoms of the story. Their names were lost, but their images multiplied. People claimed to see pale figures drifting through the abandoned streets, eyes closed as though still asleep, hands groping blindly for objects they no longer needed. Children were told not to stray too near the valley, lest one of the sleepers touch them and pull them into slumber forever. Farmers swore that at night they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps along the edges of their fields, though no footprints remained by morning. One of the most enduring tales was of the white woman. She was said to wander the ruins of the village, dressed in a gown that shimmered like frost, her face veiled. Those who saw her insisted she carried a child in her arms, though the child never made a sound. To some, she was the spirit of a mother who had died in the tragedy, endlessly searching for her family. To others, she was the embodiment of the curse itself, a spectral guardian ensuring that the village's fate would never be disturbed or forgotten. If she met your eyes, it was said, you would fall into a sleep from which you might never wake. Other tales were stranger still. Travelers spoke of hearing bells from the valley at night, though no church bell had survived. The sound was faint, mournful, and it came only on certain nights of the year, most often around the harvest, when the veil between worlds was thought to be thinnest. Shepherds told of their flocks suddenly lying down in unison when driven too close to the cursed ground, as though some invisible hand pressed upon them. Some claimed the earth itself was poisoned, that nothing would grow there, that seeds planted in its soil would rot before they sprouted. By the time centuries had passed, the story of the sleeping village was no longer told as history, but as warning. Parents invoked it to hush their children. Go to bed or the sleepers will take you. Preachers thundered from pulpits, using the tragedy as proof that wickedness brings destruction. Folklorists recorded fragments, always half-believing, always unsettled. For unlike other ghost tales, this one had the weight of a real place behind it, a hollow in the earth that travelers could point to and say, there, that is where it happened. Even as the Enlightenment spread, even as science reshaped how people understood the world, the legend of the village endured. Rational men dismissed it as myth, yet they did not linger in the valley. Maps began to omit the name, yet cartographers left a blank space where it had once been. Superstition clung stubbornly, as if the land itself resisted being forgotten. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when ghost stories became fashionable again, the sleeping village re-emerged with new force. Writers wove it into Gothic tales, poets invoked it as metaphor, paranormal investigators sought it out, eager to capture proof of its lingering energy. Photographs circulated of misty streets and darkened windows, though skeptics dismissed them as tricks of light and shadow. The legend adapted to each era, shape-shifting to suit the fears of the time. In an age of spiritualism, it became a tale of lost souls. In the Cold War it was whispered of as an experiment gone wrong, a test site erased from official records. In modern times, it is shared on forums and whispered in documentaries, a story too strange to dismiss, too rooted in history to ignore. Perhaps the most haunting part of its legacy is its persistence. Many tragedies of history are forgotten within a few generations, erased by larger wars, greater disasters, or the apathy of time. Yet the sleeping village lingers, not as fact, but as a wound in cultural memory. It resists closure. It resists explanation. It exists in the half-light between history and folklore, always waiting to be rediscovered, retold, re-feared. What draws us to it still? Perhaps it is the strangeness of the death itself, the calmness of the bodies, the absence of violence. Or perhaps it is the idea that such a fate could happen anywhere, at any time, that an entire community might simply close its eyes and never wake again. The legend reminds us of the fragility of life, the thin line between waking and dreaming, between the natural and the supernatural. But there is also something deeply human in its persistence. We tell stories not only to remember, but to explain. And when explanation fails, story becomes myth. The haunted legacy of the sleeping village is less about what truly happened, and more about what it represents, the fear of sudden erasure, the dread of silence, the unease that comes when an entire way of life can vanish without reason. And so, the villagers live on, not in their homes, not in their names, but in the whispers of strangers centuries later. Their tragedy has become a mirror for our own fears, reflecting what we dread most, the possibility of vanishing without cause, of slipping into a silence no one can break. The haunted legacy is not just theirs, it belongs to all who tell the story, all who shiver when they hear it. It is the proof that some tragedies never end. They echo, they transform, they become legend. And sometimes, legend is more powerful than history itself. As centuries passed, the memory of the sleeping village might have been expected to fade into obscurity. But in truth, its silence grew louder in modern times. With the rise of archaeology, folklore studies, and eventually paranormal investigation, the tragedy became not only a legend but an object of inquiry. Where earlier generations spoke in whispers, the modern world brought lanterns, notebooks, cameras, and recorders into the valley, each determined to pierce the silence. What they found, or believed they found, only deepened the mystery. In the late 19th century, when folklore was being systematically collected across Europe, researchers stumbled across fragments of the village's story in rural oral traditions. Old men recounted how their grandfathers had warned them never to enter the hollow, Women spoke of lullabies that referenced the sleepers, songs meant to soothe children, but which carried sinister undertones. Close your eyes, but not too deep, or join the village, lost in sleep. Folklorists were struck by the consistency of the tale across multiple regions. Though details varied, the core remained intact. A village vanished into slumber, never to awaken. By the early 20th century, the story caught the attention of occult enthusiasts. The Society for Psychical Research in Britain received letters referencing the case, some claiming that the site of the village emitted a pressure in the air that induced headaches, nausea, and disorientation. A small team even traveled to the region in the 1920s. Their published notes were frustratingly inconclusive. They recorded no ghosts, no apparitions, but they described the overwhelming stillness of the place, a silence so total that even insects seemed absent. One researcher wrote, "It is not that one hears nothing, but that one feels something instead, a silence with weight, a silence that intrudes upon thought itself." During the 1960s and 70s, the age of paranormal television and sensational tabloid journalism, the sleeping village resurfaced with lurid fascination. Articles claimed that hikers who camped in the valley reported vivid synchronized dreams, visions of strangers walking through their tents, whispering in languages they did not know. Others swore they awoke with the sensation of having been watched, their belongings subtly rearranged during the night. Skeptics argued these were nothing more than tricks of suggestion, the mind primed by legend to perceive what it expected. But believers saw them as proof that the sleepers had never truly left, that the boundary between their eternal dream and our waking world was thin, fragile, and easily crossed. More disturbing still were accounts of missing time. A pair of campers in the 1980s claimed they woke to find their watches had stopped at precisely midnight, only to resume when they left the valley the following morning. Another traveler reported walking into the hollow just after dawn and emerging to find the sun setting, though by his reckoning only an hour had passed. Whether these stories were exaggerations, hallucinations, or something stranger, they added a new layer to the village's reputation. It was no longer just a place of death, but a place where time itself bent unnaturally. In recent decades, paranormal investigators armed with thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and audio recorders have entered the valley seeking answers. Their footage is predictably inconclusive, yet chilling in its own way. Recordings filled with static, interrupted by faint whispers, photographs where human shapes seemed to blur at the edges, temperature readings that dropped sharply in certain homes, as though an unseen draft lingered perpetually. None of it would satisfy a skeptic, yet all of it fuels the enduring allure of the site. What fascinates modern audiences most is not only the mystery of what happened, but the universality of its resonance. The story of the sleeping village has been compared to other mass mysteries: the lost colony of Roanoke, the ghost ship Mary Celeste, the vanished Njikuni village in Canada. Each involves absence, the sudden erasure of people, the haunting quiet left behind. Yet the sleeping village differs in one crucial way: its inhabitants were found, not vanished into thin air, but present intact, preserved in death that looked too much like sleep. That detail keeps it from being dismissed as mere disappearance. It forces us to confront something far more unsettling, not where they went, but what came for them. And so the story persists online today, in documentaries, podcasts, and viral videos. Some frame it as unsolved history, others as paranormal case study, still others as allegory. In forums, people speculate endlessly. Was it a gas leak centuries before such things were understood? A mass poisoning? An ancient curse? Or was it something stranger, something that even now waits in the hollow for the next visitor careless enough to linger? What is undeniable is that the story has transcended its origins. It is no longer only about a single village, but about the questions it embodies. Can entire communities vanish without reason? What forces, natural or otherwise, are we still blind to? And most chilling of all, could it happen again? In the modern imagination, the sleeping village is not only a historical enigma, but a mirror. It reflects our fascination with the thin boundary between science and the supernatural, between reason and fear. It forces us to acknowledge that, for all our technology, some mysteries remain impenetrable. And perhaps that is why we return to it again and again, not to solve it, but to feel its weight, to brush against the silence that even centuries cannot explain. Every great mystery invites explanations, and the sleeping village is no exception. Across centuries, scholars, skeptics, and believers alike have wrestled with the same haunting question: how could an entire community simply lie down and never rise again? While natural causes, disease, toxins, or famine dominate most discussions, there exists another, more unsettling category of explanation. The possibility that the villagers were taken, not by illness, but by something that reached into their very minds. The theory of mass hypnosis emerges here, occupying the crossroads between psychology and the supernatural. It proposes that the villagers did not die of any tangible affliction, but succumbed to a collective trance, a communal dream from which none returned. To modern ears, the notion sounds like science fiction, yet mass psychogenic events are well documented throughout history. Entire crowds have fallen into frenzies, overcome by laughter, tears, or convulsions without clear cause. These contagions of the mind spread invisibly, riding waves of fear and belief. Could the village's eternal sleep have been such an event, an outbreak of slumber, impossible to stop once it began? Proponents of this theory point to the eerie uniformity of the villagers' deaths. No signs of struggle, no attempts to flee, no evidence of pain. It was as if the people had been compelled, lulled by an unseen rhythm. Some folklorists even speculate that it could have been ritual in origin, a ceremony gone wrong, an invocation that spiraled out of control, binding the entire community into unconsciousness. In this interpretation, the tragedy becomes less an accident and more an experiment in control, with consequences far beyond what the villagers could have foreseen. Yet mass hypnosis alone cannot account for death. Sleep may explain stillness, but not the finality of lifeless bodies. This gap between theory and outcome opens the door to darker interpretations. What if the villagers' trance was not self-imposed, but imposed upon them? What if some force, human or otherwise, exerted its will so completely that the villagers not only surrendered consciousness, but life itself? This possibility resonates with occult traditions. Across many cultures, there are tales of words, songs, or incantations that rob people of will. In some grimoires, there are references to sleeping curses, spells designed to immobilize armies, villages, even kingdoms. These texts are often dismissed as metaphor, but in the context of the sleeping village, they gain a chilling relevance. Imagine an incantation whispered across a valley, a vibration that pulled every mind into stillness. Imagine the silence that followed, broken only by the sound of breathing, then nothing at all. Linked to this is the idea of psychic contagion, a concept popular in occult and fringe psychology circles during the late 19th century. It suggests that intense emotion or thought can spread like a virus, carried telepathically across groups. If one villager fell into a trance, the theory goes, others nearby might have followed, not out of conscious choice, but through some invisible synchronization of the mind. Once begun, the cascade would be unstoppable, a domino effect of unconsciousness rippling outward until the last soul succumbed. Skeptics, of course, dismiss such notions as fantasy, yet even science recognizes the profound influence of suggestion. Consider how yawns spread through crowds, how hysteria can seize entire schools, how mobs behave as though ruled by a single will. Is it so far-fetched to imagine a village united not by choice, but by compulsion? Still others take the theory one step further, suggesting that the hypnosis was not born of human origin at all. They point to legends of beings who thrive on dreams, spirits, demons, or entities that drain vitality through slumber. In European folklore, these were often depicted as night hags or shadow people, figures who pressed on the chest of sleepers, stealing breath until death arrived. Could the village have been visited not by plague, but by something older, something that fed on their surrender? A particularly eerie version of this tale speaks of a dream shepherd. According to fragments of local lore, the shepherd would walk through villages at night, playing a flute or singing softly. Those who heard the melody would fall into step behind him, eyes closed, smiling faintly. He would lead them into the hills, and by morning they would never wake. Some folklorists see in this myth a distorted memory of the sleeping village itself, a way to personify what happened when explanations failed. Others argue that the story predates the tragedy, hinting that the village may have been targeted, chosen as prey. Of course, mass hypnosis, psychic contagion, and occult interference all share the same flaw. They cannot be proven. There are no recordings, no evidence, only silence where testimony should be. Yet perhaps that is their strength. The impossibility of disproving them allows the legend to breathe, to evolve. Each generation projects its own fears onto the story. For some, it is fear of manipulation, of losing control of one's mind. For others, it is dread of the unseen forces that stalk the threshold of sleep. Psychologists who entertain the theory often frame it as allegory, rather than fact. They argue that the sleeping village represents humanity's oldest anxiety, the loss of agency, to be stripped not only of life but of choice, to fall under a spell so absolute that resistance never occurs. That is a nightmare more terrifying than violence or plague. And perhaps that is why the story endures. It is not simply about death, but about surrender. In the end, whether hypnosis, contagion, or curse, these theories remind us that the human mind is as fragile and mysterious as the body. We know so little of how consciousness works, how easily it can be swayed or shattered. The village's tragedy may have been natural, it may have been supernatural, but in either case, it forces us to ask an unnerving question. What if our thoughts, our very waking selves, are not as secure as we believe? The villagers, it seems, learned the answer too well. They closed their eyes, perhaps thinking they would wake again. Instead, they became the eternal dreamers, prisoners of a silence that even centuries cannot break. If natural explanations falter and psychological ones leave gaps, then the imagination inevitably drifts into darker waters. For centuries, villagers, travelers, and storytellers alike have whispered of supernatural forces at work in the tragedy. To them, the village did not simply die, it was claimed. It was pulled into a shadow world, punished by entities unseen, or cursed by powers that neither church nor science could ward off. One of the most enduring supernatural theories is that the village was struck by a curse. In rural folklore, curses are not vague notions. They are tangible forces, invoked by words, gestures, or rituals. A curse lingers like smoke, invisible yet suffocating, binding itself to land, bloodlines, or communities. Some say the villagers angered a wandering holy man, refusing him food or shelter on a stormy night. Others insist they desecrated a sacred grove, cutting down trees older than memory itself. Still others believe greed was their undoing, that the community hoarded wealth, cheated neighbors, or betrayed allies, and in return, God or fate struck them down. The tragedy, in this telling, was not random but retribution, a divine sleep imposed for sins no one dared name aloud. Yet the notion of a curse raises its own mysteries. If punishment was intended, why sleep? Why not fire, flood, or plague, the usual scourges of divine wrath? The specificity of slumber feels deliberate, symbolic. In some occult traditions, sleep is a form of exile, a way of trapping souls between realms. To fall asleep and never wake is to be suspended, neither alive nor truly dead, drifting in a limbo from which escape is impossible. Could it be that the villagers were not punished with death, but with eternal dreaming? Could their souls still wander the dreamscape, unable to return? Another explanation casts the tragedy not as punishment, but as possession. Folklore is thick with stories of malevolent beings who infiltrate communities, draining their vitality. In Slavic traditions there are tales of the Mora, a spirit that presses on sleepers' chests, suffocating them slowly. In other regions, demons were believed to walk among villages, their true forms hidden beneath human faces. These entities did not kill with knives or claws, but with influence, weaving dreams that ensnared their victims' minds. In this light, the tragedy could be seen as the work of such an entity, not slaying the villagers directly, but leading them gently into eternal night. Some folklorists even draw parallels to the Fae, those otherworldly beings of European legend who blur the line between blessing and curse. To cross them was dangerous. Entire groups were said to vanish after offending them, spirited away to dance in endless circles beneath hollow hills. Could the sleeping village have been another such theft? Perhaps the bodies found were not truly bodies, but shells, hollow vessels left behind after the Fae carried the villagers' souls into their realm. The silence of the village, then, would not be death, but absence. Their essence gone, only their husks remained, faces peaceful, as if dreaming elsewhere. But the most chilling of all theories may be that the tragedy was not divine punishment or demonic interference, but the arrival of something far older, an ancient force tied to the land itself. Across cultures, there is a recurring belief that certain places are thin, fragile, easily torn between worlds. These thin places are thresholds where spirits wander, where the veil between the living and the dead grows permeable. Perhaps the village was built on such ground, knowingly or unknowingly. Perhaps the act of settling there was itself a provocation, and perhaps one night, the veil tore completely. Something passed through, something vast, nameless, incomprehensible. The villagers caught in its shadow could do nothing but surrender to the tide. Eyewitness stories collected centuries later seem to feed this interpretation. Travelers speak of unnatural stillness, of air that feels heavy and thick, of shadows that seem too long for the objects that cast them. Some claim to hear faint murmurs in the ruins, as though voices are still trying to reach across dimensions. Skeptics dismiss these as echoes of fear, the mind imposing pattern on silence. But for believers they are traces, remnants of an event so powerful it scarred the fabric of reality itself. In the modern paranormal community, the sleeping village is sometimes described as a dead zone. Investigators speak of batteries draining instantly, equipment malfunctioning, compasses spinning without reason. They interpret these anomalies as signs of residual energy, a kind of psychic imprint left by mass death, but others take a more terrifying stance. Perhaps the energy is not residual at all, but active, alive, watching. They argue that the tragedy was not a one-time event but an ongoing hunger, and that anyone who lingers too long risks being drawn into the same endless sleep. This fear is amplified by personal accounts of dreams. Hikers who spend a single night near the ruins often report vivid, unsettling visions. They dream of strangers with closed eyes walking in silence. They see endless halls of shadow, filled with whispers. Some wake with scratches on their arms, as if touched by unseen hands. Others wake gasping, unable to move for several minutes, a sensation chillingly close to sleep paralysis. Paranormal enthusiasts suggest that the village does not merely haunt the waking world, but invades the dream world, ensnaring those who cross its boundary. If true, then the villagers may not be gone at all, they may still be dreaming, and their dream may be contagious. Yet for all its terror, the supernatural explanation carries a strange comfort. If a curse, a spirit or a cosmic force is to blame, then perhaps the villagers were not abandoned to randomness. Perhaps their fate, while horrific, was part of a pattern, a story larger than themselves. This idea appeals to something deep in human nature, the need to believe that tragedies happen for reasons, not by accident, even if that reason is dark, even if it involves forces beyond comprehension. It feels less frightening than the thought of senseless annihilation. Still, the image remains a village asleep, unmoving, untouched by time, whether cursed, possessed, stolen or sacrificed. The supernatural theories all return to the same conclusion, that the villagers did not simply die, they were taken. Their silence is not just absence, but evidence of a power that waits in the margins of our world, ready to remind us how fragile our waking lives truly are. And so, the story of the sleeping village drifts through centuries, not as history alone but as myth, a myth that warns us of the dangers of arrogance, of ignorance, of treading too close to forces we do not understand. A myth that insists there are places where the veil thins, where curses echo, where dreams are traps, places where to sleep is to risk never waking again. At some point, every legend must be brought back down to earth. Every mystery, no matter how enshrouded in folklore, invites a final confrontation with reality. The sleeping village is no exception. For all the talk of curses, spirits, and dream plagues, there remains the question what, if anything, can be said with certainty. When the myths are stripped away, what remains in the silence? Skeptics, historians, and scientists have long attempted to tether the tragedy to the ordinary world. They argue that the human mind gravitates toward mystery, embellishing what cannot be explained until it becomes unrecognizable. In their view, the story of the sleeping village may be less about an impossible event and more about layers of exaggeration, misreporting, and folklore. Perhaps, they say, the villagers did not all die in a single night. Perhaps famine thinned their numbers over weeks, and later generations compressed the suffering into a single haunting image. Or perhaps disease claimed them suddenly, and the memory of their peaceful bodies, untouched by violence, gave rise to the illusion of slumber. In other words, the tragedy may have been real, but its telling was shaped by centuries of human imagination. But there are problems with this explanation. If it were only disease, why the absence of visible symptoms? If it were famine, why no signs of struggle for food? And if it were embellishment, why do accounts remain so consistent across regions and generations? Even skeptics admit unease. One historian wrote in the 19th century, "I am inclined to believe the tale exaggerated, yet I confess the image lingers. It does not behave as other myths do. It clings too tightly to detail. The rational theories, poisoning, gases, illness, still have their proponents. Each has its strengths, yet each falters when pressed against the silence of the site itself. Visitors do not describe the remnants of a natural disaster. They describe a presence, a weight, an absence of life that cannot be catalogued in any ledger of science." Skeptics dismiss this as psychological suggestion, the power of story infecting perception. But is it really so easy to separate story from place? Or does the story itself become part of the landscape, woven into the soil, shaping what those who walk there will feel? This is where the confrontation with reality becomes slippery. Facts alone cannot untangle the tragedy, because the tragedy has become more than facts. It has become memory, myth, metaphor. The village's fate may have once had a single explanation, but centuries of retelling have transformed it into something larger, something more enduring. In that sense, perhaps the question of what truly happened is less important than what the story means. And what does it mean? On one level, it is a reminder of fragility. Communities can vanish. Lives can be erased in an instant. Civilization is not a fortress but a fragile scaffolding, vulnerable to the unseen. On another level, it is a parable. Theories of punishment, of curses, of arrogance, leading to downfall. These speak less to the villagers themselves and more to those who kept their memory alive. The legend became a mirror, reflecting each generation's fears. To medieval peasants, it was divine wrath. To Victorians, it was a riddle of science. To us, it is a horror story, an unsolved mystery to share in the flickering glow of screens. But there is also something more intimate at play. Death, after all, is universal. The sleeping village forces us to look at death, not as violence or chaos, but as silence. The image of peaceful bodies, eyes closed, breath gone, it resonates because it looks so much like our own inevitable fate. Perhaps this is why the story lingers so powerfully. It is not just about a village lost, but about the recognition that one day we too will close our eyes. The tragedy frightens us because it erases the distinction between sleep and death, between the temporary and the eternal. Skeptics may insist on natural causes, but even they cannot deny the emotional weight of the image. One anthropologist wrote, "Whether true or exaggerated, the tale grips us because it embodies our deepest dread, that death will come not with warning, not with reason, but with the quiet gentleness of sleep, leaving us unprepared." And so, the confrontation with reality does not dissolve the mystery. It reshapes it. Even if one accepts the most mundane explanation, say toxic gases seeping from the earth, the horror remains. It is the image of an entire village robbed of mourning, caught in a single breathless moment. That image does not require the supernatural to terrify. It terrifies because it shows us how thin the thread of waking life truly is. Perhaps then, the most unsettling truth is this: the legend may not matter. Theories may not matter. What matters is that we are still talking about it centuries later. The silence of the sleeping village continues to echo, louder than screams, more enduring than evidence. Its reality is not measured in bones or ruins, but in memory. It has become immortal, not because of what truly happened, but because of what we cannot let go. To confront the story with reality is to confront ourselves, our fear of the unknown, our hunger for meaning, our refusal to accept randomness. The villagers are gone, yet we carry them forward, reshaping their fate again and again, making them eternal in ways they never chose. And perhaps that is the final cruelty, that even in their silence, they are not allowed to rest. They are trapped not only in slumber but in story. As the centuries roll on, skeptics will continue to probe, believers will continue to whisper, and travelers will continue to shiver at the valley's edge. But no one will ever resolve the paradox at its heart. A village went to sleep and never woke again. That is the fact, or the myth, or both, and whichever it is, it remains too powerful to release. Reality, in the end, cannot defeat the story. It can only stand beside it, humbled, uncertain, and haunted. There are stories that slip away with time, forgotten in the shifting sands of history. And then there are stories that cling to us, that burrow deep into our imagination, resisting silence. The sleeping village belongs to the latter. It is not just a tale of death, nor only a puzzle of history. It is something larger, a shadow cast across centuries, reminding us of how fragile the boundary is between waking and never waking again. As we reach the end of this journey, the questions remain. What happened in that valley on that night, or across those nights, that left an entire community lying still, faces serene, eyes closed, as if caught between dream and death? Was it a sickness too strange for us to name? A natural catastrophe written in whispers instead of thunder? Was it poison in the air, invisible and merciless? Or was it something older, something unseen, something not bound by the laws we know? The truth, if it ever existed clearly, has long been devoured by time. All we are left with is silence. Silence in the ruins, silence in the stories, silence that spreads like a shroud whenever the tale is told. And perhaps that is the most unsettling answer of all, that we may never know. But there is something important in that not knowing. Mystery, after all, is not just absence. It is a kind of presence, a reminder that the world is larger than our explanations. The sleeping village is not merely about the fate of a few hundred souls lost centuries ago. It is about us, about the limits of human understanding, about the haunting possibility that life can be extinguished without warning, without cause, without witness. When we think of death, we imagine endings marked by violence, by illness, by pain. But the villagers remind us of another possibility, that death can come quietly, like a shadow crossing a room, like a lullaby sung too softly to resist. They remind us that life is less secure than we dare admit. One moment, laughter and conversation. The next, silence absolute. No cries, no warning, only stillness. It is tempting to dismiss the legend as superstition, as folklore embroidered through centuries of retelling, and perhaps it is. But even folklore carries weight. Myths survive not because they are true in the literal sense, but because they tell truths of another kind. Truths about our fears, our fragility, our desperate search for meaning in the face of the incomprehensible. And the truth, the sleeping village tells us, is chilling in its simplicity. Nothing is guaranteed. Tomorrow is not promised. Waking itself is not promised. To close our eyes is to place ourselves in the hands of forces we cannot control. Every night we perform the ritual the villagers once did, lying down, surrendering consciousness, trusting we will return. For them, that trust was betrayed. For them, the ritual never ended. It is no wonder that their story has endured. It strikes at the heart of a universal fear, not pain, not violence, but disappearance. The fear of being here one moment and gone the next. with no reason, no resolution, no explanation. Their silence becomes our silence, their sleep a mirror of our own, reminding us of how fragile each breath is, how easily it might stop without warning. But beyond fear, there is also a strange beauty in their story. The villagers did not die in agony. They did not fall to swords or flames or terror. They slipped into stillness together, a community preserved in peace. There is something haunting, yes, but also something almost tender in that image. Mothers and fathers, children and elders, all bound by the same eternal slumber, untouched by violence. They were lost, but they were lost together, and perhaps that too is why their story lingers. It is not only a horror story, but an elegy for the fragility of life, for the inevitability of death, for the mystery of forces that lie beyond our grasp. It is a reminder that even in silence, even in absence, there is meaning. Today, the valley remains. Empty, but not empty. Silent, but not forgotten. Those who walk its paths say they feel watched, as though the village still breathes beneath the soil, waiting. They speak of dreams that cling to them long after they leave, of whispers that brush the edges of their hearing. Whether these are tricks of suggestion or echoes of something more, who can say? But one thing is certain, the villagers are not gone. They live on in every retelling, in every shiver, in every breathless pause when the story is spoken aloud. And so we are left not with answers but with echoes. Echoes of footsteps that no longer sound. Echoes of voices that no longer speak. Echoes of a community that closed its eyes and never woke again. The eternal silence of the village is not only theirs, it is ours too, waiting at the edge of sleep, waiting at the end of every day. Perhaps, when we close our eyes tonight, we will think of them. Perhaps we will feel the weight of their silence pressing close, a reminder of how fragile waking truly is. And perhaps in that moment, we will understand why their story endures. Not because it can be solved, not because it can be proven, but because it forces us to confront the most profound mystery of all, that one day, like them, we too will sleep, and not wake again. The story of the sleeping village is not over. It never will be. It lives wherever silence falls heavy, wherever dreams feel too real, wherever the line between life and death blurs. It lives in us, in our fears, in our fascination. It is an eternal reminder that the unknown still waits, patient and unyielding. The villagers are still sleeping. Their silence is eternal, but through the telling, through the remembering, through the shiver that runs down the spine as we speak of them, they are awake. And perhaps that is the greatest paradox of all, that in never waking, they have achieved a kind of immortality. The village that went to sleep and never woke again still breathes in our stories, and as long as we tell it, as long as we whisper it in the dark, they will never truly be gone.